Hello, I'm Santa Montefiore and I'm going to read you an extract from my new comedy, Flappy Entertains, that comes out on the 4th of March. I wrote it in lockdown with the sole purpose of giving my readers something to laugh about. I hope it makes you laugh and helps you get through this ghastly pandemic. In a nutshell, Flappy Scott Booth is the self-appointed Queen of Badley Compton, which is a coastal town in the southwest of England. She's very put out because a new couple have arrived in town and bought the bigger house, and she's very concerned that they're going to sit in her and her husband Kenneth's front row seats in church. Chapter 3. On Sunday morning, Flappy was in a hurry to get to church. Kenneth, who liked to take his time over breakfast and read the Sunday papers in a leisurely fashion, was not. "Why are you so desperate to get there on time?" he asked as she climbed into the passenger seat of his Jaguar 15 minutes before the service was due to start. Normally, they would be the last to arrive at 1 minute to 10. Everyone knew that. "Because, darling," she began as he climbed into the driver's seat and stretched the belt over his big belly, "our places in the front pew are not official, which means when Hedda and Charles arrive, they might very well sit in them. There is nothing and no one to tell them they can't. But if we are in them, they will understand the unspoken rule and not attempt to usurp them." Kenneth started the engine and the Jaguar purred contentedly. "Why do you think they want to sit in the front row?" "Because they have bought the biggest house in town. I suppose it is a teeny bit bigger than ours." "They might want to sit in the middle or at the back. They might not be as competitive as you think they are." Flappy smiled patiently, as if she were explaining something very simple to a very simple person. "Darling, you couldn't even remember who Hedda Harvey-Smith was, let alone what kind of woman she is. I can tell you, from the brief moments I have spent with her, that she is an exceedingly competitive woman." She laughed lightly and gave a little sniff. "Of course, she has no idea how transparent she is, how easy she is to read. I've always maintained that competitive people are just insecure people and should have our sympathy, not our condemnation. Still, it doesn't mean I'm going to allow her to sit in our seats in church. One's generosity has limits, doesn't it, Kenneth?" "It does," he agreed, because life ran more smoothly when he agreed with his wife. "That is why we must get there early. Not too early, just 5 or so minutes. I'm sure Hedda will swan in at the last moment. I know her type. She will want to make an entrance." As Kenneth drew up and parked on the curb, Flappy saw, to her dismay, a black Bentley already parked right in front of the gate that opened into the churchyard. She had never seen that car before, which meant only one thing, that it belonged to the Harvey-Smiths. Her skin bristled with rivalry. If it did indeed belong to Hedda and Charles, there could be no doubt that they were already inside the church, possibly at this very moment luring themselves into her and Kenneth's seats. An image of Hedda's large behind gave Flappy a moment's relief, because hers was small and toned due to her morning yoga sessions. But she was in too much of a hurry to savour her sense of superiority. She needed to get into church right away while there was still time to make an intervention. Leaving Kenneth to catch her up, she strode purposefully along the path. "Did you see that Bentley?" she said to him when he reached her. "A beauty," he replied. "I wouldn't trade my Range Rover for a Bentley, even if you paid me," she said, lifting her chin. "But then I'm terribly discreet. I'm not sure discretion is one of Hedda Harvey-Smith's most notable qualities." They entered the church to find the pews packed and the congregation full of chatter. Flappy's aquiline vision immediately honed in on Hedda Harvey-Smith at the front of church talking to the vicar. Without a moment's hesitation, Flappy marched down the aisle. She didn't look to her left or right, or acknowledge the expectant faces of her friends who turned to her like sunflowers. She didn't have time to bestow greeting. Right now, she had an important matter to attend to. As she approached them, the vicar raised his eyes and smiled at her, for besides being the local vicar, he was also a friend. After all, it was important for the Queen of Badley Compton to be on good terms with God. Hedda, noticing his straying gaze, turned around. When she saw Flappy, her expression changed. She beamed a smile, the kind of smile one gives to a cherished old friend one hasn't seen in a very long time. "Flappy, my dear," she said, holding out her hands. Flappy returned her smile, although it didn't quite reach her eyes, and took the sturdy, unmanicured hands. "Hedda, how lovely to see you." "You look so well, Flappy. Have you been away?" "We always spend a couple of weeks in our house in the Algarve in July. I suppose I have retained my tan, although I never ever put my face in the sun." "That's why you look so young," said Hedda. Then, to Flappy's astonishment, she sat down in Flappy's seat. Without apology or hesitation or the slightest indication that she was even aware of the faux pas she was making, she plonked herself down as if it were just an ordinary pew. A moment later, before Flappy had time to prevent it, a breathtakingly handsome grey-haired man, who Flappy realised with a stab of envy was Hedda's husband Charles, came and sat beside her in Kenneth's seat. Flappy, for once in her life, was dumbfounded. She stood there, lips parted in amazement, eyes wide with horror. "Oh, Flappy, there you are," said Kenneth, rescuing her in the nick of time. "Why don't we sit on the other side in the third pew? There are 2 free places." Flappy was not to be defeated. She inhaled through her nostrils, gathered her wits, and smiled graciously down at Hedda and Charles. For if there was one thing Flappy was good at, it was being gracious in times of crisis. "Hedda, darling, you and Charles are in our seats." She put out her hand to prevent them from getting up. "Please, no apology. I'm delighted that you enjoy the view from the front row. We've enjoyed it for over 20 years. It's the least we can do to share it with you who have just arrived in Badley Compton." She shifted her eyes to Charles, who was gazing at her with the most beautiful green eyes she had ever seen. They were the colour of sea glass and as mesmerising as Kipling's car. Flappy caught her breath, falling suddenly into the beautiful green. "Flappy Scott Booth," he said in a voice so aristocratic it seemed to vibrate over her body in a delightful caress. "Yes," she breathed. "It's a pleasure to meet you. I've heard so much about you." "Oh," said Flappy, forgetting suddenly how to speak. "You're as charming as they say you are," he said, and then he smiled and Flappy's stomach flipped. It had never done that before, not even when Kenneth had flashed the Cartier diamond engagement ring at her on the terrace of the Palace Hotel in St. Moritz. With her legs turned to dough and her words still lost in muddled thoughts, she dug deep, very deep, for her willpower and managed to tear herself away. Flappy, in the third row, which was a terrible affront to her dignity, was unable to keep her eyes on the vicar. She could only see the back of Charles's head and a sliver of his profile, but it was enough. How on earth had Hedda managed to ensnare such an attractive man? Of course, she wasn't unattractive herself. Her face was pleasant enough, and her eyes, big and brown, were warm and intelligent. But if one judged them from the perspective of the food chain, she and Charles were on very different levels. He was a white tiger or a silver fox, and Hedda was... Flappy narrowed her eyes and considered Hedda's stout body, her thick brown hair and long eyelashes. "An Ayrshire cow," she concluded with satisfaction. The vicar gave a rousing sermon, to which Flappy would have normally listened with great focus so that she could comment on it later. But today she didn't hear a word, not a syllable. Her mind was whirring, and not with the things with which it usually whirred. Never before in her life had she been so immediately smitten. Never before had she felt so powerless to resist. Never, not ever, had she felt bestial without at the same time feeling utterly embarrassed and ashamed. Charles Harvey Smith, in a few short sentences and one very long, lingering look, had awakened the beast within, and Flappy was a new woman.